What would you do if the world you built on logic, on the simple physics of force and fracture, suddenly collapsed? What happens when a man who breaks stone for a living strikes a simple statue of plaster and faith, only to find that his hammer, his strength, and his entire worldview are the things that shatter? This is the story of Elias, a man whose heart was harder than the granite he carved, and of a statue of the Virgin Mary that refused to break, choosing instead to mend the man who was determined to destroy it. It began with a city council order, a simple job of demolition, but it ended in a place where the veil between worlds grew thin, and a miracle watered the dusty soil of a forgotten town. Elias was a man made of dust and angles. His hands were maps of calluses and faint white scars, the legacy of a life spent convincing stone to yield to his will. He ran the town's only masonry, a yard filled with the ghosts of headstones and the promises of countertops. He believed in the simple, brutal honesty of his trade. He believed in stress points, in fault lines, in the satisfying crumble of rock under the persuasion of steel. He did not believe in anything he could not weigh, measure, or break. His faith, whatever it had once been, was now just another headstone in the graveyard of his past, a monument to a grief he never spoke of. It had died somewhere in a distant, sun-scorched land, alongside the boy he had called brother, a brother in arms and in spirit. He had come home from that war with a medal on his chest and a quarry's worth of stone in his heart. The town of Havenwood treated him with a quiet, respectful distance, as if he were a piece of unexploded ordnance. They saw the hero, but they felt the coldness that radiated from him like a winter chill. Havenwood itself was a town that felt like a long, slow sigh. Its faith was a tired thing, a collection of rituals performed out of habit rather than conviction. The old church, St. Jude's, stood at the center of the town square, its steeple pointing an accusatory finger at a sky that rarely seemed to listen. And in a forgotten corner of the churchyard, tucked away behind an overgrown cypress tree, stood the object of the town's latest bout of civic progress. It was a statue of the Virgin Mary. It was not a masterpiece. Carved from simple stone and covered in a thick layer of plaster and paint, it had been weathered by decades of neglect. The blue of her robe was faded to the color of a washed-out sky, and a network of fine cracks traced her serene face like the delicate lines of age. To most, she was an eyesore, a relic of a more sentimental time. To Elias, she was just a job. The town council, led by a pragmatic man named Mateo, had decided she had to go. They were building a new, modern fountain, a symbol of Havenwood's slow march into the present. The old statue, they argued, was a crumbling liability. Mateo, who believed more in property values than in prayer, had drawn up the work order himself. Demolish and remove. Simple. Elias had taken the job without a second thought. It was 2 days' work, a few $100s. He had walked over to the churchyard the day before, his steel-toed boots crunching on the gravel path. He stood before the statue, his shadow falling over her placid face. He noted the decay, the way the plaster had flaked away near the base, revealing the pockmarked stone beneath. He ran a practiced hand over the surface. It felt chalky, brittle. "Not much of a fight in you, is there?" he had muttered to the statue. A dry, humorless sound escaped his lips, more a cough than a laugh. It was the only kind of humor he possessed anymore, a sharp-edged thing he used to keep the world at bay. Statues did not speak. Statues did not feel. Statues broke. It was the one truth he could rely on. The next morning, he arrived with his tools. The sky was a sheet of iron gray, promising a heat that would bake the dust into the back of his throat. He set his toolbox down and pulled out his favorite sledgehammer. Its head was scarred from 1,000 other victories against stone. Its hickory handle was dark with the sweat of his labor. It felt like an extension of his own arm, an instrument of his unbending will. A few people had gathered at a respectable distance. Anna, an old woman whose face was a testament to every sorrow and joy the town had ever known, watched from the church steps. Her small granddaughter, Maria, held her hand, the child's dark eyes wide with a silent curiosity. Elias ignored them. He was a performer on a stage of his own making, and his audience was irrelevant. He spat on his hands, rubbed them together, and gripped the hammer. He positioned himself, feet planted wide. This was his sanctuary, the moment before impact. Here, in the anticipation of destruction, he felt a flicker of something that resembled peace. He drew the hammer back, his muscles coiling like thick ropes. He put the full force of his body, the full weight of his hardened heart, into the swing. He aimed for the center of the statue's torso, the place where the praying hands met. The hammer arced through the humid air. He braced for the explosion of plaster, the crack and shatter of stone. The impact was all wrong. Instead of a sharp crack, there was a dull, resonant thud. It was a sound like striking a great bell cast from lead. The hammer stopped dead, the vibration shuddering up the handle and into his bones, a painful shock that rattled his teeth. He stumbled back a step, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at the statue. There was not a mark, not a chip, not even a new crack in the ancient paint. A small cloud of plaster dust, dislodged by the vibration alone, settled gently around the statue's base. It was as if he had struck a mountain. From the church steps, he heard a soft gasp. He clenched his jaw, a hot flush of anger and embarrassment rising in his neck. He was Elias, the man who broke stone. This was not possible. The statue was mocking him with its silent, infuriating stillness. He thought of the men he had known who relied on prayer. He had seen them die, their pleas swallowed by the indifferent sand. This statue was a symbol of that same empty hope, that same useless faith, and it was defying him. "All right," he growled to the empty air. "You want to be stubborn." He swung again, harder this time. The same soul-jarring thud echoed across the square. The hammer bounced back with such force it was nearly wrenched from his grasp. His wrist screamed in protest. Still, the statue stood, serene and untouched. A trickle of sweat traced a path through the grime on his temple. This was no longer a job. It was a battle, a contest of wills between a man of flesh and a figure of stone. And Elias was not a man who knew how to lose. For the next hour, he waged his war. He attacked from different angles, striking the base, the shoulders, the veiled head. Each blow was met with the same impossible, sound-absorbing resistance. The head of his hammer began to deform, its steel face dented and chipped from the impacts. But the statue remained whole. The crowd of onlookers grew. Matteo, the councilman, arrived, his arms crossed, a frown creasing his brow. He saw the sweat pouring from Elias, the futile violence of his efforts. He saw the pristine, undamaged statue. "What is the problem, Elias?" Matteo's voice was laced with impatience. Elias did not turn. He was panting, his lungs burning. "The stone," he gasped out, gesturing with the hammer. "It's wrong." Matteo scoffed. "It's plaster and cheap limestone, Elias. I have the original commission report from 1952. Just break it." "I am trying." Elias roared, the sound raw and desperate. He spun and swung again, a wild, frantic blow that landed high on the statue's shoulder. Thud! The hammer vibrated violently, and with a sickening crack, the wooden handle splintered, sending the heavy head flying off to the side where it landed in the dust with a dull thud. Silence fell over the square, a profound, ringing silence. Elias stood there, panting, holding the jagged stump of the handle. He was defeated by a forgotten piece of religious art. The shame was a physical thing, a hot coal in his stomach. Anna, the old woman, slowly descended the church steps, her granddaughter Maria still clutching her hand. She walked toward Elias, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped beside the statue and placed a frail, wrinkled hand on its base. "You mock what you do not understand," she said, her voice soft but carrying in the stillness. "She has stood through floods and storms. She has watched our children be born and our parents be buried. She is more than stone, Elias." Elias glared at her, his chest heaving. "It's a rock," he said through gritted teeth. "Just a rock." But as the words left his mouth, a sudden chill swept through the square, a cold breath in the humid air. And across the square, the little girl, Maria, coughed. It was a small, dry sound at first. Then it became a racking spasm that bent her small body in two. Anna rushed to her side as the child's face grew pale, her eyes fluttering shut as a strange, sudden fever seemed to seize her. The town's whispers started then. They were quiet at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but they grew in volume. The broken hammer, the unbroken statue, the suddenly sick child. In the fearful logic of a small town, the lines were drawn, connecting the three events into a terrifying pattern. Elias's act of violence had not just been against a piece of stone. It had been an offense. And now, something was demanding a price. The days that followed were a slow descent into a waking nightmare for Elias. He returned to the statue with heavier tools. He brought a star drill and a maul, determined to prove that physics still held sway in Havenwood. The hardened tip of the drill bit shattered against the statue's placid face, sending shards of metal whining through the air. He tried a diamond-tipped cutting wheel on his angle grinder. The blade screamed and threw sparks, but it only succeeded in polishing a small, brilliant patch on the statue's robe before the motor burned out with a foul-smelling puff of blue smoke. He became a prisoner of his own pride, returning to the churchyard each day to resume his futile assault. The work was no longer about a contract. It was about his own sanity. Every clang of his tools against the unyielding stone was a blow against the doubt that was beginning to fester in his soul. He worked until his hands were bleeding, until his muscles burned with an exhaustion so deep it felt like it was in his bones. At the same time, a shadow fell over the town. Maria's condition worsened. The local doctor was baffled. It was a fever with no apparent cause, a deep lethargy that pulled the child further and further away from the waking world. She was moved to the small county hospital, her small form lost in a sterile white bed. Anna never left her side, her face a mask of prayer and grief. The townspeople now looked at Elias with open hostility. They saw him, covered in stone dust and sweat, a man fighting a losing battle against a silent protector, and they blamed him. His war with the statue was seen as the cause of the child's suffering. Doors closed as he walked by. His masonry business dried up completely. No one wanted anything from the hands that had tried to break a miracle. He was isolated, marooned on an island of his own making. He began to see her even when he was not at the churchyard. In the grain of a piece of wood, he would see the fold of her robe. In the reflection of a puddle after a brief rain, he would see the outline of her veiled head. He was haunted by her serene, silent defiance. His sleep was filled with the ringing sound of his own failed efforts, the dull thud of steel on something more than stone. His skepticism, once a fortress, was cracking. He had built his life on tangible things, on the predictable laws of the physical world. That world was now lying in ruins around him. The statue stood as a monument to its failure. What was it made of? What power did it hold? He began to ask himself questions that terrified him. One evening, a week into his siege, he slumped onto the bench opposite the churchyard, utterly defeated. His body ached. His spirit was hollowed out. Matteo found him there, staring at the statue as the sun set, bathing it in hues of orange and purple. "This has gone on long enough, Elias," Matteo said, his voice softer than usual, stripped of its usual authority. "The town is afraid. People are talking. They're saying it's a sign." "A sign of what?" Elias asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Of God. Of something. They say you have angered it." Elias let out a short, bitter laugh. "It's a statue. It doesn't get angry." But even as he said it, the words felt hollow, a lie he could no longer make himself believe. "Maria is not getting better," Matteo continued quietly. "Her fever won't break. The doctors in the city have no answers. Anna is praying. The whole town is praying." Elias looked from Matteo's worried face to the impassive statue. For the first time, a sliver of genuine fear pierced through his pride. What if they were right? What if his arrogance, his violent disbelief, had somehow untethered this sickness and set it loose on an innocent child? The thought was a cold weight in his gut, heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. He had seen enough suffering in his life. He had caused some of it himself, a fact he worked hard to forget every single day. But this was different. This was a child. He looked at his own torn and bleeding hands. These hands had brought him nothing but failure. His strength had proven to be a useless, brutish thing. All his tools were broken. He was broken. He was alone, in the encroaching darkness, with the silent, watching statue. His defiance had crumbled away, leaving only a vast, empty space filled with desperation. He looked up at the serene, maddeningly peaceful face, now just a silhouette against the twilight sky. He did not kneel. His pride would not allow him that. But he bowed his head, the gesture stiff and unfamiliar. The words that came were not a prayer. They were a surrender, a plea torn from the deepest part of his shattered self. "Please," he whispered to the stone, the sound swallowed by the evening air. "I don't know what you are. I don't know what you want. But please, don't let these children suffer. Not for what I've done." It was the most honest thing he had said in years. He expected nothing. He expected the same silence that had met his rage. He closed his eyes, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. And for the first time since he had returned from the war, he felt the sting of tears. He must have fallen asleep on that bench, a sleep born of pure emotional and physical exhaustion. But it was not a restful sleep. He found himself in a place that was not a place, a landscape of quiet gray mist, silent and still. There was no sound, no wind, nothing but a profound and total peace. Before him stood the statue, but it was no longer stone. It was a woman, cloaked in a blue that seemed to hum with its own soft light. Her face was the same serene face from the statue, but it was alive, and it was filled with a sorrow so deep and so ancient it felt like the grief of the world itself. He could feel her sadness, but it was not directed at him. It was a sadness for him. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but no words would form. He was frozen in place, not by fear, but by an overwhelming sense of awe. This was not an apparition of anger or judgment. It was a presence of pure, unconditional compassion. She did not speak with her lips, but the words bloomed inside his mind, gentle and clear, like the chime of a distant bell. They were not words of condemnation, but of quiet instruction. "My son waits for you." He did not understand what it meant, not fully, but he understood the feeling behind it. It was a key, an opening, an invitation out of the prison he had built for himself. The woman of light raised a hand, not toward him, but towards something beyond him, back in the direction of the world he had left behind. In her gaze, he saw not only her own sorrow, but a reflection of his. He saw the battlefield. He saw the face of his fallen friend. He saw the grief he had encased in stone. He saw it all, and he felt her seeing it with him, sharing the impossible weight of it. Then, a single, luminous tear slid down her cheek. As it fell, it did not vanish into the mist. It glowed brighter and brighter, and as it touched the ground, the air around him was suddenly, impossibly, filled with the scent of roses, a fragrance so rich and real it made his heart ache. He awoke with a gasp. He was still on the bench. The first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky, and the air was cool and damp with dew. The world was the same, but he was not. The stone in his chest was gone. The suffocating weight of his grief, the bitterness that had been his constant companion for years, had been lifted. In its place was a profound and inexplicable peace. He felt hollowed out, but not empty. He felt clean. He looked at his hands, no longer seeing them as instruments of force, but as something new. He stood up and walked slowly, hesitantly, toward the statue. The anger was gone. The defiance was gone. All that remained was a sense of wonder. He reached out and gently, reverently, laid his palm against the statue's stone cheek. It was cold, solid. It was just stone. And yet, it was everything. He saw the hairline cracks his foolish rage had failed to widen. He saw the chipped paint and the weathered surface, and he no longer saw decay. He saw endurance. He saw a quiet strength that had absorbed his hate and given back nothing but patience. He sank to his knees. The movement was not forced this time. It was a natural release, a yielding of his entire being. He knelt in the dirt and the plaster dust, a broken man before an unbroken symbol, and he wept. He wept for his lost friend, for his lost faith, for the years he had wasted carrying his armor of anger. He wept until there was nothing left but the quiet calm of the new morning. When he finally rose, he knew what he had to do. He went to his workshop, but he did not pick up a hammer. He returned with buckets of clean water, soft rags, and gentle brushes. He began to clean the statue, washing away the decades of grime and the fresh dust of his own assault. He worked with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed, his movements a quiet apology, a prayer in motion. The townspeople began to emerge, drawn by the strange sight. They saw Elias, the destroyer, now tending to the statue with the care of a penitent. They saw no tools of destruction, only buckets and cloths. They watched in silence as he worked, the early morning sun glinting off the water that ran in rivulets down the statue's clean, white surface. Anna was the first to approach. She said nothing. She simply walked to the base of the statue and placed a single, perfect white rose at its feet. It was an act of forgiveness, an act of faith. And then, a sound cut through the quiet reverence of the morning. It was the frantic ringing of the telephone in the general store across the square. A moment later, the owner burst out onto the steps, his face pale with shock, his eyes wide. "It's the hospital," he shouted, his voice cracking. "It's Maria. Her fever, it's gone. Just like that. The doctors, they can't explain it. She woke up 10 minutes ago and asked for her mother." A collective gasp went through the crowd. All eyes turned from the store owner to Elias, who stood frozen, his hand still on the statue. He looked at the statue's face, now clean and bright in the morning sun, and he knew. He knew with a certainty that went deeper than logic, deeper than reason. The tear he had seen in his dream, the scent of roses, the impossible healing of a child, it was all connected. It was a tapestry of grace, and he was an unwitting thread within it. The healing of Maria was the first miracle. The healing of Havenwood was the second. The story of the statue that would not break spread like a gentle fire. People who had not set foot in St. Jude's for years found themselves drifting back, filling the pews not out of habit, but out of a renewed sense of wonder. The town's cynical heart had been broken open. Elias was no longer an outcast. He was a witness. He never spoke of his vision in the mist, not in detail. He did not need to. The transformation in him was testimony enough. The hardness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet humility. His strength, once used to break things, was now dedicated to mending them. He repaired the church's crumbling steps, reset the tilting headstones in the cemetery, and helped rebuild a neighbor's collapsed wall after a storm. He worked silently, asking for nothing in return. The town council, led by a humbled and speechless Mateo, abandoned their plans for a new fountain. Instead, the community came together. With Elias guiding the work, they built a simple but beautiful grotto around the statue. They planted rose bushes that flourished in the dry soil as if by magic. The statue itself they left as it was. The dents from his hammer, the scorch mark from his grinder, the fine web of cracks. They preserved these imperfections. They were now part of her story. They were a testament not to her weakness, but to her strength. A reminder that even things that are damaged can be holy. A reminder that a broken heart can be mended, and that faith, sometimes, is simply the thing that refuses to shatter when the world insists that it should. The statue of Havenwood became a quiet beacon, a place where people came to lay their own brokenness at her feet, trusting that her silent strength was more than enough to bear the weight. The story of Elias and the unbroken statue serves as a powerful reminder that our deepest transformations often begin at our breaking point. It teaches us that faith is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to persist when all logic tells us to quit. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not grand, loud events, but the quiet, impossible healing of a single human heart, which then radiates outward to heal a community. We all face statues in our lives, problems that seem unmovable, griefs that feel unbreakable. But this story suggests that when our own strength fails, a different kind of strength is waiting, a grace that meets our desperation not with judgment, but with a love that can mend any fracture.